Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the weekly report. Forget the Russians, it's the Federal Reserve seeking to meddle in our elections. The U.S. Constitution never granted the federal government authority to create a central bank. The founders, having lived through hyperinflation themselves, understood that government should never have a printing press at its disposal. But from the very beginning of America's founding, the desire for a crony central bank was strong. In fact, 2 attempts were made at creating a permanent central bank in America prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve. Fortunately, the charter for the first bank was allowed to expire in 1811, and President Andrew Jackson closed down the second bank in 1833. But unfortunately, a third attempt was successful, and the Federal Reserve was unconstitutionally created by Congress in 1913. Americans have been living under a corrupt and immoral monetary system ever since. The Federal Reserve is the printing press that financed the creation of the largest government to ever exist. Endless welfare and endless military spending are both made possible by the Federal Reserve. The Fed can just print the money for whatever the U.S. establishment wants, so those of us who long for a constitutional and limited government have few tools at our disposal. Despite all the propaganda claiming independence, the Fed has always been a deeply political institution. Because the Fed is a government-created monopoly with key government-appointed employees, its so-called independence is a mere fiction. However, the U.S. Congress created the Fed with legislation. It can also abolish the Fed with legislation. Last week, the facade of the Federal Reserve independence was dealt a severe blow. Ironically, the person who broadcast to the world that the Fed is anything but independent was ex-New York Fed President Bill Dudley. Dudley wrote that Trump's re-election arguably presents a threat to the United States and global economy. And if the goal of monetary policy is to achieve the best term economic outcome, the Fed's officials should consider how their decisions would affect the political outcome of 2020. The timing of Dudley's threat to use Fed monetary policy to affect the outcome of a U.S. election couldn't come at a more striking time. After all, for more than 2 solid years, Americans have been bombarded with fabricated stories about Russians rigging our elections. And yet here it is, a Federal Reserve official threatening to do the same exact thing, but this time for real. Whether it's the mainstream media, the CIA, the FBI, or now the Federal Reserve, more and more Americans are waking up to the fact that there is a deep state in America, and its interests have nothing to do with American liberty. In fact, our liberty is what the deep state wants to abolish. When it comes to the Federal Reserve, I stand firmly by my conviction that it needs to be audited and then ended as soon as possible. America's founders were not perfect. They were human beings just as capable of error as we are. But they had a remarkable understanding of the ideas of liberty. They understood that liberty cannot exist with a government that has access to a printing press. Sound money and liberty go hand in hand. If we want to enjoy the blessings of liberty, we must audit and then end the Federal Reserve. Thanks for listening.